In the summer of 2019, a small preservation crew from eastern Kentucky was hired to disassemble a 200-year-old chapel in a remote hollow of the Cumberland Plateau. The building had been condemned for years. The roof had caved in during an ice storm the previous winter. The congregation had dissolved in 1968, and the last preacher, a man named Elias Vernon Hatfield, had walked out of the front door on a Sunday morning in October of that year, locked it behind him, and never spoke of the place again until his death in 2004. The crew was there for one reason: salvage the beams, save the hand-hewn pews, document the stonework for the County Historical Society. It was supposed to take 4 days. It took 41. Because when they lifted the altar stone on the third afternoon, they found something underneath that was never supposed to be found. Something the chapel had been built on top of deliberately in 1847 by a group of settlers who called themselves the Watchers of the Deep. Something that had been sealed for at least 4 generations. And something that, according to the notes the foreman kept in a spiral-bound notebook that was later confiscated by 2 men in unmarked vehicles, was still active. The altar stone weighed just over 800 pounds. It was carved from a single piece of banded limestone that did not match any quarry within 400 miles of the site. Beneath it, cut directly into the bedrock of the hollow, was a vertical shaft, perfectly circular, 47 inches in diameter, its walls smooth to the touch, as if polished, its depth unknown. When the crew dropped a plumb line down the opening on the 4th day, they let out 380 feet of cord before the weight stopped moving. But it did not stop because it had hit the bottom. It stopped because something on the other end had grabbed it. That is not a figure of speech. The line went taut. It was pulled sideways with enough force to yank the foreman off his knees, and when they hauled it back up, the weight, a 2-pound lead sinker, was gone. In its place, tied to the end of the cord with what appeared to be human hair, was a small copper coin bearing markings that no numismatist in Kentucky or Tennessee has ever been able to identify. That coin now sits in a locked drawer at the University of Louisville, unlabeled and uncatalogued, because the professor who received it in September of 2019 refuses to touch it without gloves and refuses to discuss it on record. This is the story of what the preservation crew found under that altar. This is the story of what the chapel was really built to contain. And this is the story of why, if the theories about our lost history, about the Great Mud Flood, about the calendar reset, and about the civilization we now call Tartaria are true, then that chapel in the hollow was not a house of worship at all. It was a lid. Before we go any further, do me one small favour. If you are watching this right now, type the name of the state you are watching from in the comments below. Just the state. That is it. The reason I am asking is because there is a pattern to where these chapels were built across America, and I want to see if any of you are sitting within 100 miles of one right now, without knowing it. You will understand what I mean by the end of this video. For now, drop your state in the comments, keep the video playing in the background, and let us continue. The preservation crew was small, 4 men and 1 woman. They were all from Perry County, all in their 40s or early 50s, all experienced with old timber structures. The foreman was a man named Callum Reese Whitaker, 62 years old, a former coal engineer turned historical carpenter. He had worked on 11 churches in the region over the previous decade. He had disassembled log meeting houses, restored slate roofs, and once spent 6 months rebuilding a Shaker barn near Pleasant Hill. He was the kind of man who kept a mechanical pencil in his shirt pocket and drew every joint by hand before he cut it. The chapel sat at the end of a fire road in what the local map called Bittersweet Hollow. The nearest paved road was 7 miles down the mountain. The nearest house was a hunting cabin belonging to a family named Corbin, and it was 3 ridges over. Cell service on the property was non-existent. The crew had a satellite phone in the truck for emergencies and a small generator for their power tools. On the first morning, Callum walked the perimeter of the building alone. He was looking for the things that always mattered in a job like this: foundation settlement, water damage, evidence of animal habitation, the general soundness of what he was about to take apart. And on that first walk he noticed 3 things that did not fit. The first thing was the orientation of the chapel. Every rural church in the Appalachians from the 19th century faces east. It is a tradition older than Christianity itself, older than the Roman calendar, tied to the idea that the resurrection comes from the direction of the sunrise. But this chapel did not face east. It faced almost exactly true north. which is a bearing so unusual for a building of its type that Callum wrote in his notebook that morning, and I quote from the notebook directly: "This chapel is not aimed at heaven, it is aimed at something else." The second thing he noticed was the stone. The chapel walls were built of a course of banded grey limestone at the foundation, rising about 3 feet above grade, before transitioning to hand-hewn chestnut logs above. That was normal for the region. What was not normal was that the limestone at the foundation did not appear to have been laid by human hands. The joints were too tight. There was no mortar between the stones. And when Callum ran his fingers along the seams, he could not fit even a business card between them. He wrote in his notebook, "This foundation was here before the chapel was built. The chapel is sitting on top of something older." The third thing was the smell. Not inside the building, outside. Along the base of the north wall, at the exact spot where the altar would later be found, sitting directly above the shaft, there was a faint cold smell rising from the ground. It was not the smell of decay. It was not the smell of stagnant water. Callum described it in his notebook as the smell of a deep well in winter. Iron, wet stone, something else underneath. He mentioned all 3 of these observations to his crew at lunch. Nobody thought much of them. Old buildings are strange. Every job has its quirks. They finished the day by removing the collapsed roof shingles and stacking the salvageable slate to the side. Before we move on to the next passage, stop for a second. What you just heard about the 3 anomalies at the chapel is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original foreman's notebook. The northward orientation, the wrong stone. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. That night, back in the motel in Hazard, Kentucky, Callum called the County Historical Society and asked about the chapel's records. He wanted to know who had built it, when it had been consecrated, and what denomination had used it. The archivist on the phone, a woman named Miss Adeline Pruitt, told him that the chapel's records were incomplete. There was a deed from 1847 listing the property as being transferred from a man named Josiah Hurst Fairbanks to a group of settlers described in the deed as the Watchers of the Deep. There was no denominational affiliation. There were no baptismal records. There were no marriage records. And there were no burial records, despite the fact that a small cemetery of 19 unmarked graves sat on the ridge above the chapel. Miss Pruitt told him one other thing, almost as an afterthought, at the end of the call. She said that in 1951 a Baptist minister from Louisville had visited the chapel with the intent of writing a historical article about it for a regional religious journal. He had spent one afternoon inside the building. He had left before sundown. And when he got home to Louisville, he had burned every note he had taken, and written a single letter to the diocese asking that the chapel be, in his exact words, quote, "left alone by any Christian who values his soul," end quote. Callum wrote that down in his notebook, then he underlined it twice, then he went to bed. He did not sleep well. On the second morning the crew began work on the interior. They removed the pews one by one and stacked them in a canvas-covered pile outside. The pews were made of hand-hewn chestnut joined without nails, and the underside of each one bore the same symbol carved into the wood by a single maker's mark. The symbol was a circle with a horizontal line through its centre. Not a cross, not a wheel, just a circle bisected by a line. Callum photographed each one. He would later learn that this symbol does not correspond to any known Christian denomination, any known Masonic order, or any known Appalachian folk tradition. It appears in exactly 2 other places in the historical record, both of which we will get to shortly. While the crew worked on the pews, Callum sat in the truck with his laptop and a satellite hotspot and began pulling every scrap of information he could find on the Watchers of the Deep. There was almost nothing. The name appeared in the 1847 deed. It appeared in a single census record from 1850, which listed 9 adult men and their families as residents of Bittersweet Hollow with their profession given as, quote, keepers, end quote. And it appeared in one letter dated 1863 written by a Union scout who had passed through the hollow during the Civil War. The scout described the community as, quote, a settlement of quiet people who do not attend the war on either side and who spend their days watching a hole in the ground that they will not speak of, end quote. That was it. 3 references in the entire historical record. A deed, a census, a letter. But the letter was interesting for another reason. because at the end of it, the scout described being shown the chapel by one of the settlers, an older man he called only Brother Ephraim. The scout wrote that he was taken inside, shown the altar, and told, and again I quote from the letter directly, that beneath the stone lay the mouth of a passage older than the mountains themselves, and that the settlers had come to this hollow not to build a town, but to guard the passage until such a time as it could be safely closed forever. The scout did not believe the old man. He thought he was talking about a cave. Kentucky is full of caves. Mammoth Cave is only 130 miles to the west. Caves in the Appalachians are as common as creeks. So the scout laughed politely, thanked Brother Ephraim for the hospitality, and rode out of the hollow the next morning. His letter, which now sits in the archives of the Filson Historical Society in Louisville, notes at the very bottom, almost as a postscript, that as he rode away from the chapel he could hear a low sound coming from beneath the earth. He described it as, quote, a sound like a great engine breathing in and out very slowly, or perhaps a very large animal sleeping, end quote. He rode out that morning and never returned, but he did make one more note in his personal journal, which was found among his effects after his death in 1891, and which the Filson Society keeps in the same file as the letter. In the journal he wrote that for the rest of his life, whenever he closed his eyes to sleep, he could still hear that sound, and that on certain nights, especially when the moon was new, he could hear it answering him from beneath his own house in Cincinnati, Ohio, 400 miles away. That is the historical context the crew was working within on that second day. Callum did not know most of it yet. He would learn most of it in the weeks after the discovery, once he began pulling every document he could find on the property. But he did know enough by the end of that second day to feel the weight of the place. He knew the chapel faced the wrong direction. He knew the foundation predated the building. He knew the pews carried a symbol that did not belong to any known tradition. And he knew that a Baptist minister in 1951 had told his diocese to leave the building alone. The crew removed the pulpit on the afternoon of the second day. Under the pulpit, cut into the floorboards, they found a trapdoor. It was small, perhaps 18 inches by 18 inches. It was hinged with hand-forged iron, and it was sealed with a padlock that had rusted shut so completely that it looked as if the lock and the hasp had fused into a single piece of metal. The trapdoor did not lead to a basement. There was no basement to the chapel. The floor of the chapel sat directly on the limestone foundation, and the limestone foundation sat directly on the bedrock of the hollow. Whatever the trapdoor covered, it was cut into the bedrock itself. The crew broke the lock at 4 in the afternoon. Callum lifted the trapdoor, and inside the small opening beneath it, they found a leather-bound book. The book was small, about the size of a modern paperback, but half again as thick. Its cover was black leather, dry and cracked with age, but still intact. There was no title on the front, no embossing, no decoration of any kind. When Callum lifted it out of the trapdoor cavity, he noticed that the leather felt slightly warm to the touch, which he later attributed to a trick of the mine, but which the crew's electrician, a woman named Deirdre Loomis Hollis, would later swear she also felt when she held the book briefly on the 5th day. The book was wrapped in a square of oilcloth. The oilcloth was tied with a length of leather cord, and inside the oilcloth, resting against the front cover of the book, was a folded piece of paper. Callum opened the paper first. It was a letter, handwritten, in ink so faded it was nearly the colour of the paper itself. The letter was dated the 22nd of March, 1847, and it was addressed to, quote, whoever comes after us and finds this book, end quote. I am going to read you the letter in full, because it is the single most important document that came out of the entire chapel. It sets up everything that follows. The original is now in a private collection in Ohio, having been sold by Callum's widow after his death in 2023. But a photocopy of it, made by Callum on his own scanner in the days after the discovery, was published in a small-run academic journal called Regional Folklore Studies in the spring of 2022. That is the source for what I am about to read. The letter begins as follows, quote, to whoever comes after us and finds this book, we do not know when you will come. We hope it is never. We hope the passage stays sealed until the end of the world, and then some time after. But if you have found this letter, then the passage is no longer sealed, or it is about to no longer be sealed. And you must know what we know before you decide what to do next. We are the watchers of the deep. We came to this hollow in the spring of 1847, 9 men and their families from a town in Pennsylvania that no longer exists. Our town was called Acre. It was near what is now the city of Erie. In the winter of 1846, the ground beneath Acre opened, not in an earthquake, not in a landslide. It opened the way a door opens along a seam that had been there all along without anyone knowing. And out of that opening came things that we will not describe here, because to describe them is to summon them, and we do not have the strength for that anymore. The town of Acre was destroyed in a single night. 211 people died. 9 men and their families, and 1 old woman who was not from our town, but who arrived on the morning of the disaster with a wagon and a warning, survived. The old woman told us that the opening at Acre was not the first. She said there were passages like it all across the eastern mountains, sealed long ago by a people whose name we do not know and whose language is lost. She said the seals were failing. She said the passages were beginning to open again. And she said that if the world was to be saved, then men would have to become the seals themselves, not by dying, by watching, by sitting on top of the openings generation after generation and keeping them shut with their attention. We came to this hollow because the old woman brought us here. She said there was a passage beneath a certain limestone outcrop, and she showed us where. We built the chapel on top of the outcrop. We cut the shaft down through the bedrock ourselves, following the natural crack in the stone, because the passage below was not accessible from the surface without a shaft. We sealed the top of the shaft with the altar stone. We began the watching. The old woman died in 1849. We buried her on the ridge above the chapel, in the first of the graves you will find there, which we did not mark because she asked us not to. Her name was Ada Winifred Cramwell. She was, by her own account, 142 years old at the time of her death. She spoke 6 languages fluently and could read 3 more. She was not, in our judgment, entirely human. But she was on our side, and she saved what was left of us, and we will not speak ill of her. We have watched the passage for 100 years. Our children have watched it. Our grandchildren have watched it. The line is beginning to thin. There are not enough of us left. When the last of us is gone, the chapel will be abandoned, and the altar will sit on the shaft alone, and it will hold for a time, but not forever. If you have opened the trapdoor and found this letter, then you are the next watcher, whether you chose to be or not. You have 3 choices. The first choice is to reseal the trapdoor, walk away, and tell no one. The altar will continue to hold. The passage will continue to be quiet. You will die of old age in your bed. This is the choice we recommend. The second choice is to lift the altar and see what is beneath it. We will not tell you what you will find, because we do not know what you will find. What we buried is not what may still be there. The passage is old, and things may have moved. If you choose this, you will not die of old age in your bed. The third choice is to move to this hollow, build a house on this land, and take up the watch yourself. If you choose this, we thank you. We do not envy you, but we thank you. Signed on this, the 22nd of March, 1847, by the 9 of us: Ephraim Josiah Hurst, Silas Winston Boudry, Thomas Alden Fairbanks, Benjamin Corbin Whitaker, Ezra Malachi Vance, Jonas Kane Redfern, Samuel Ithamar Boone, Micah Hollis Culpepper, and Aaron Delaney Sharp." End quote. Callum stood in the chapel with that letter in his hand for a long time. His crew stood around him. Nobody spoke. Outside, the wind moved through the chestnut trees on the ridge, and somewhere in the hollow below a hawk called once and then was silent. Then Callum did the thing that, in every version of this story that has ever been told, is the wrong thing to do. He chose option 2. The decision to lift the altar was not made lightly. The crew argued about it for the rest of that afternoon and into the evening. Deirdre Loomis Hollis, the electrician, was against it. She said the letter was clear, that option 1 was the right choice, and that they should reseal the trapdoor, walk out of the hollow, and never come back. She was outvoted 3-2. The other 3 crew members, all men, felt that the letter was almost certainly a piece of 19th century folk theatre. A creative bit of historical drama, perhaps meant to scare off treasure hunters, perhaps written by a religious eccentric with too much time on his hands. Callum was the deciding vote. He wrote in his notebook that evening that he did not fully believe the letter, but that he did not fully disbelieve it either, and that as the foreman of a preservation crew, he had a professional obligation to document what was underneath the altar before the building was disassembled, and the opportunity was lost forever. The altar was lifted on the 3rd afternoon. It took most of the day. The stone weighed just over 800 pounds, as we mentioned, and it was set into a shallow depression in the floor that had been carved to receive it. The crew rigged a tripod hoist over the altar using 3 of the salvaged roof beams and a chainfall they had brought for the heavier stonework. It took 4 men to guide the stone as it lifted. Deirdre stood by the door with the satellite phone in her hand, ready to call for help if anything went wrong. Nothing went wrong, exactly. The stone came up smoothly. The hoist held. The chainfall clicked steadily. But as the stone rose, a change came over the chapel that everyone present noticed at the same time. The temperature inside the building dropped, not by a little, by a great deal. Callum wrote in his notebook that it went from approximately 72 degrees Fahrenheit to what he estimated as 45 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 90 seconds. This is not physically possible in a wooden building on a warm afternoon in July. There is no mechanism by which the air temperature in a large open space can drop that fast without a source of active cooling. But it happened. All 5 members of the crew reported it. All 5 could see their breath by the time the altar was 3 feet off the ground. The second change was the light. The chapel had no electricity. The crew was working by natural light coming through the windows and by 2 battery-powered work lamps set up on stands. As the altar rose, both work lamps began to dim. Not flicker. Dim, steadily and evenly, as if their batteries were being drained by an outside force. Deirdre, who was the electrician and who had checked those batteries herself that morning, would later say that when she pulled the batteries out of the lamps that evening, they were completely dead, and when she tried to recharge them, they would not hold a charge and had to be discarded. The third change was the sound. This is the one that Callum wrote about at greatest length, and the one that all 5 crew members agreed on most emphatically. As the altar rose, a sound began to come up out of the shaft beneath it. It was very low. Deirdre, who is a trained sound engineer as a hobby, later said it was in the range of about 18 hertz, which is below the threshold of normal human hearing but well within the range of felt vibration. The sound was rhythmic. It came in slow, even pulses, approximately 12 pulses per minute. Callum wrote in his notebook that it sounded like, quote, breathing, end quote. The altar was set down on a pallet 10 feet away from the opening. The crew stood back. For a long moment nobody moved. Then Callum walked forward and looked down into the shaft. He described what he saw in his notebook that evening. The opening was, as we said, perfectly circular, 47 inches in diameter. Its walls were smooth to the touch, but they were not smooth like polished stone. They were smooth like glass. When Callum ran his flashlight beam down the walls of the shaft, the beam did not scatter. It reflected, as if the walls had been fused, as if the shaft had not been carved through the bedrock with iron tools, but had been melted through it by something much hotter than any 19th century blacksmith could have produced. He shone the flashlight straight down. The beam disappeared into darkness after about 60 feet. There was no bottom visible. There was no water reflecting at the base of the shaft. There was only depth. He dropped a small stone down the opening. He counted. He did not hear it hit anything for a full 9 seconds, which, if the equation for a freely falling body in a vacuum is applied, and if the walls of the shaft are frictionless enough to permit near free fall, would place the bottom of the shaft at approximately 1,300 feet below the chapel floor. He wrote that number in his notebook and underlined it. Then he wrote a question mark next to it. Then he wrote, "This is not a well." The crew set up the plumb line the next morning. That is when they let out 380 feet of cord before the weight was pulled sideways. That is when the copper coin appeared in place of the lead sinker. That is when Deirdre began packing her tools into her truck and telling Callum that she was leaving. She did leave on the morning of the 5th day. She drove her truck down the fire road, turned onto the paved road, and drove back to Perry County without stopping. She did not answer her phone for 2 weeks. When she finally spoke to Callum again, in mid-August, she told him one thing and refused to say anything else. She told him that on the night after she left the chapel, at approximately 2 in the morning, she had woken up in her own bed with the certain and absolute knowledge that something was standing at the foot of her bed watching her. She could not see it, she could not hear it, but she could feel it, and it was, in her exact words, the same thing that had been at the bottom of the shaft. She never went back to the hollow. She never worked on another historical building. She sold her tools 6 months later and took a job as a bookkeeper at a lumber yard in Whitesburg. She still lives in Perry County. She still refuses to talk about what happened in Bittersweet Hollow, except to say that Callum should have listened to her when she told him to reseal the trapdoor. After Deirdre left, the crew was down to 4. Callum wanted to keep working. The remaining 3, all men, were nervous but willing. They agreed to give it 2 more days. They would document the shaft, take photographs, collect samples of the wall material, and then reseal the trapdoor and finish the disassembly of the chapel as originally planned. That was the agreement. 2 more days. On the morning of the 6th day, Callum descended into the shaft for the first time. He did not go far. 12 feet down, using a climbing harness rigged to the tripod hoist and a headlamp strapped to his hard hat. He was down for less than 15 minutes, but in those 15 minutes he saw something that changed the entire nature of the investigation. The walls of the shaft were not blank. They were covered in writing. The writing began about 8 feet below the surface. It was not carved into the stone. It was etched in what appeared to be a very fine, very deliberate line into the glassy surface of the shaft wall. The lines were shallow, perhaps a millimetre deep at most, but they were perfectly precise. The characters, if they were characters, ran in vertical columns from top to bottom, each column about 4 inches wide, and they wrapped around the entire circumference of the shaft in a continuous band. Callum photographed the writing extensively with a small digital camera he had lowered down on a strap. He counted approximately 240 distinct characters in the first 4 feet of writing. He noted that the characters did not repeat in any pattern he could immediately recognize. He noted that they did not resemble any writing system he had ever seen, including the various Proto-Cherokee syllabaries he had studied for a previous restoration project, the Norse runic alphabets, or the various Old World scripts he had a passing familiarity with. But he did note one thing, and it was the thing that would eventually lead him to the historian in Ohio who would help him understand what he was looking at. He noted that certain characters, perhaps 1 in every 20, bore a strong resemblance to a script called Voynich. That is the name given to the writing found in the Voynich manuscript, the famous illustrated codex held at the Banneker Rare Book Library at Yale University, which has never been deciphered and which most modern scholars date to the early 15th century. Callum knew about the Voynich manuscript because his daughter, Bethany Ellen Whitaker, had written a paper on it in college. She had shown him photographs of the pages. He remembered the strange plant illustrations, the astronomical diagrams, and the flowing script that had defeated code breakers for over a century. And when he was crouched in the shaft that morning, staring at the etched characters on the wall, he recognized shapes. Not all of them, but enough of them. Enough that he wrote in his notebook when he came back to the surface, and I quote, "The writing in the shaft matches Voynich. This is impossible, but there it is." He came out of the shaft. He sat on the chapel floor for a long time. He drank a bottle of water. Then he called his daughter. Bethany did not answer. She was teaching a class that morning at the community college where she worked. Callum left a voicemail. He described what he had found. He asked her to come to the hollow as soon as she could and to bring any reference material she had on Voynich and related undeciphered scripts. He also asked her, in a note that his crew members later confirmed, to bring a Bible. Bethany drove to the hollow the next day. She brought 2 suitcases of books, a laptop full of high-resolution scans of the Voynich manuscript, and a small leather-bound New Testament that had belonged to her grandmother. She arrived at the chapel on the afternoon of the 7th day. She looked at the shaft, she looked at the writing. She sat down on the floor of the chapel and she cried for about 10 minutes. Then she got to work. Over the next 4 days, Bethany documented the writing on the walls of the shaft in painstaking detail. She descended into the shaft herself 6 times, going deeper each time, and by the end of the 4th day she had reached a depth of 42 feet. She photographed the entire band of writing. She sketched the characters by hand. She catalogued the ones that appeared to match Voynich and the ones that did not. She noted that the writing ran in a continuous spiral down the shaft, and that at approximately every 12 feet of depth the character set changed, as if the inscription were being written in different languages at different levels. She also noted, and this is the detail that would become important later, that the writing changed direction at exactly 40 feet below the chapel floor. Above that depth, the characters were oriented one way. Below that depth, they were oriented the opposite way, mirrored across a horizontal axis, as if they were meant to be read from below rather than from above. She could not translate any of it. Nobody could. Nobody has to this day. But she did note one thing that made her stop working on the 11th day and refuse to go back into the shaft. She noted that certain characters in the lower band, the ones oriented for reading from below, appeared to be actively glowing. Very faintly, in a dim greenish light, only visible when her headlamp was turned off, only visible for the first few seconds after her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and only visible in one specific region of the shaft wall, about 18 inches across, that formed a shape that she said, and I quote from her later written account, looked exactly like the outline of a human face turned in profile. She refused to descend the shaft again after that. She stayed at the chapel for 2 more days, helping her father document the surface findings, and then she drove back to her home in Ohio. She still teaches at the same community college. She still refuses to publish anything about what she found in Bittersweet Hollow. But she did tell one colleague in confidence that she believes the writing in the shaft is not a language at all. She believes it is a containment inscription, something meant to keep the passage sealed, something meant to keep whatever was on the other side from coming through. And she believes that some of the characters, the ones that were glowing, have begun to fail. On the 15th day, Callum made the decision to go deeper. His remaining crew, now down to 3, tried to talk him out of it. His daughter from Ohio called him and begged him not to. He went anyway. He descended to 70 feet on that day. He wore a full harness, a headlamp, a chest-mounted digital camera, and a 2-way radio connected to a receiver on the surface. He carried a small canvas bag with sample tools, a notebook, and a pencil. He did not carry a firearm. He did not, by his own later admission, believe that a firearm would have made any difference. At 70 feet, the shaft opened out. This is the part of the story that has been disputed. There is no photographic record of what Callum found at 70 feet, because his chest-mounted camera failed at approximately 62 feet of depth. The digital file was later found to be blank from that point on, despite the fact that the camera had recorded normally at all shallower depths. The 2-way radio also failed at approximately the same depth. Callum was, for the 15 minutes he spent at 70 feet, completely cut off from the surface. He came back up. He described what he had seen to the crew. He wrote it in his notebook, and then he sat in his truck for 4 hours without moving, and when he finally got out, he told the crew that they were resealing the trapdoor at first light and that no one was ever going into the shaft again. What he described in the notebook, which I have seen a photocopy of, was the following. At 70 feet below the chapel floor, the shaft opened into a chamber. The chamber was, as best as he could estimate by the reach of his headlamp, approximately 40 feet across and roughly circular. Its ceiling was the underside of the shaft opening, meaning that the shaft entered the chamber from directly above. Its floor was covered in fine white sand, of a type he did not recognize, that had been raked into a pattern of concentric circles. The circles were fresh. They had not been disturbed by his descent, because he had not touched the floor. He hung from his harness about 10 feet above the chamber floor and swept his headlamp in a slow circle around the walls. The walls were lined with alcoves, small rectangular openings cut into the stone, perhaps 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, spaced at regular intervals around the entire circumference of the chamber. He counted 72 alcoves. Each alcove contained an object. He could not identify most of them in the dim light of his headlamp, but he could identify enough of them to know that whatever was in those alcoves had been placed there deliberately over a very long period of time, by many different hands. In the alcove nearest the shaft, on the north wall of the chamber, there was a human skull. It was old, it was small, it was, in his estimation, the skull of a child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. There were teeth marks on it. Not human teeth marks. He wrote in his notebook that they were the teeth marks of something with a very wide jaw and a very large number of teeth. He wrote that he did not want to think about what had left those marks. In the alcove to the left of the skull there was a book, a different book from the one they had found under the trapdoor. This one was larger. Its cover was made of some pale material that he thought might be bone. It was closed, and it was tied shut with a cord of what appeared to be woven human hair. In the alcove to the left of the book there was a small brass instrument that he could not identify. It looked, in his description, like a cross between an astrolabe and a musical tuning fork. It had 2 prongs, 3 concentric brass rings, and a small crystal at the centre that reflected his headlamp beam back at him with an intensity that hurt his eyes. In the alcoves beyond that he described objects he could not name. a folded piece of cloth that seemed to shimmer in a way that fabric should not shimmer, a wooden box the size of a shoebox sealed with dark wax, a collection of small glass vials containing liquids of various colours, some of which were still moving as if agitated, a metal helmet with narrow slits for eyes, of a design that matched no historical armour he had ever seen, a pair of leather gloves that looked as if they would fit a man twice the size of any modern human. And at the exact centre of the chamber, directly beneath the shaft opening, standing on the sand, was a chair. The chair was made of dark wood. It was tall. It was carved with the same bisected circle symbol that had appeared on the pews of the chapel above. It was empty, but the sand around the chair was disturbed in a pattern of footprints, fresh footprints, made by bare feet or by something that resembled bare feet, larger than a man's foot, but with the same general shape. 5 toes, a distinct heel, and the footprints did not lead to the chair. They led away from it in a slow spiral out toward the alcoves, and then back to the chair again, and then away, and then back, over and over. As if whatever had been sitting in the chair had gotten up recently, walked a full circuit of the chamber, visited each alcove in turn, and returned to sit down again. Callum did not see whatever had made the footprints. He wrote that he did not think it was in the chamber with him at that moment. He wrote that he had the very strong impression that it was somewhere below, in whatever passage continued down from the chamber floor, and that it had heard him arrive, and that it was on its way back up. He did not stay to find out. He signalled to be pulled up. The crew hauled him to the surface. He came out of the shaft shaking. He sat in the truck, and that was the end of the descents into Bittersweet Hollow. The crew attempted to reseal the shaft on the 16th day. They lowered the altar stone back into its original depression. They bolted the trapdoor shut with new hardware, because the original padlock was so corroded it could no longer function. They placed the leather-bound book back into the trapdoor cavity before they closed it, wrapped once again in the same square of oilcloth tied with the same leather cord. And they spent most of the day in silence doing this work, none of them speaking except when strictly necessary. But there was a problem with the reseal. The altar did not sit right. When the crew had lifted the stone off the shaft opening on the 3rd day, it had come up cleanly and evenly. When they set it back down on the 16th day, it would not settle into its depression. There was a gap, about an inch, on the north side of the stone. The crew tried 3 separate times to reset it. They shimmed it. They removed debris from the depression. They cleaned the mating surfaces. Nothing worked. The altar sat crooked. The gap remained. Callum wrote in his notebook that evening that the shaft had, quote, breathed, end quote. That was the word he used. He believed, based on nothing he could point to except his own instinct, that the removal of the altar had allowed something in the shaft to expand or shift or rise, and that when he tried to reseal it, the seal no longer fit because the shape of what it was sealing had changed. That is a strange thing to write in a notebook, but it is what he wrote. The crew finished the exterior work on the chapel over the next 3 weeks. They disassembled the log walls, they stacked the salvage beams for transport, they documented the stonework, they did not go near the trapdoor again, they tried not to look at the altar. And on the 41st day they left Bittersweet Hollow for the last time. But the story does not end there, because things began to happen in the months and years after the chapel was disassembled that suggest very strongly that whatever the Watchers of the Deep had been guarding did not stay guarded. The first thing was the death of one of the crew members. His name was Merrick Alden Yoakum. He was 37 years old. He had been the youngest member of the crew. He had descended into the shaft twice to a depth of about 20 feet each time to help Bethany document the writing. In November of 2019, 4 months after the crew left the hollow, he was found dead in his home in Hazard, Kentucky. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure. He had no history of heart disease. He was in good physical condition. He was found sitting upright in an armchair in his living room, fully dressed, with a small copper coin on the table in front of him. The coin was later determined to be identical to the one that had appeared on the plumb line on the 4th day of the excavation. His family had never seen the coin before. It was not in his belongings. It was not in his pockets. It was simply on the table, as if he had been examining it in the moments before he died. The second thing was the disappearance of Callum's daughter. Bethany Ellen Whitaker was reported missing by her husband on the 3rd of February, 2020. She had gone out for a walk in the woods behind her house in southern Ohio on a Saturday afternoon. She had not returned by nightfall. Search parties combed the woods for 2 weeks. They found nothing, no body, no clothing, no personal effects. The case remains open. Her husband, Douglas Reed Whitaker, has told journalists on multiple occasions that in the weeks before her disappearance, Bethany had begun waking up in the middle of the night and standing at the foot of the bed, staring at the wall, and that when he asked her what she was doing, she would say only, quote, "They are calling me," end quote, and then she would return to bed and remember nothing about it in the morning. The third thing was the arrival of the men in the unmarked vehicles. They came to Callum's house in Perry County on the 11th of March, 2020. There were 2 of them. They arrived in a black SUV with no license plates. They wore dark suits. They did not show any identification. They asked to see the notebooks from the Bittersweet Hollow project. Callum, who had been expecting some form of official visit for months, showed them the notebooks. They took them. They also took his digital camera, the copies of the photographs on his laptop, the leather-bound book that Bethany had been studying at the time of her disappearance, and which had been mailed back to Callum by her husband, and the copper coin that Merrick Yoakum's family had given to Callum after Merrick's funeral. They did not take the photocopy of the letter from the Watchers of the Deep. Callum had kept that photocopy in a safe deposit box at a bank in Pikeville, and he did not mention it to the 2 men. That is why we have the text of the letter today. That is why the story of Bittersweet Hollow is known at all. If Callum had kept the letter in his house, it would have been taken with the rest of the materials, and this video would not exist. The 2 men did not return. Callum tried over the following months to identify them. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the FBI, the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Land Management, and 3 other federal agencies. All of the responses came back the same. There is no record of any federal visit to your residence on the date in question. There is no record of any federal investigation of the Bittersweet Hollow property. We cannot help you. Callum died of pancreatic cancer in April of 2023. He was 66 years old. He had been sick for less than 4 months. His wife, Louisa Fay Whitaker, sold most of his effects after his death, including the leather-bound book that had been recovered from the property and then returned to him. She kept the notebooks, she kept the photocopy of the letter, and she has told the small number of researchers who have contacted her that she will not sell those items and she will not lend them for study. She will pass them to her son when she dies, and her son will decide what to do with them. In the summer of 2021, a researcher in Ohio named Corliss Vane Ashworth began collecting reports of similar structures across the eastern United States. He was a retired professor of American religious history. He had heard about the Bittersweet Hollow Chapel through Bethany Whitaker before her disappearance. He had spent the last 2 years of his life trying to determine whether the chapel was a singular anomaly or part of a larger pattern. What he found, and what he published in a small privately printed monograph in October of 2022, 3 months before his own death, is one of the most disturbing catalogues in the history of American folk religion. Corliss Ashworth identified 63 separate churches, chapels, and meeting houses across the eastern United States that share a common set of characteristics with the Bittersweet Hollow Chapel. The characteristics are as follows. First, each structure faces true north rather than east. Second, each structure sits on a limestone foundation whose joints show no mortar, and whose stones are fitted more precisely than the wooden building above them would seem to require. Third, each structure was built between the years 1830 and 1860 by a small group of settlers who arrived from somewhere else, established the building quickly, and lived on the site for at least 2 generations before the community died out. Fourth, each structure has an altar or a central platform that is anomalously heavy for its apparent purpose, and that sits on a specific spot in the floor that has been marked or reinforced. Fifth, each structure is associated in local folklore with a sound, or a smell, or a temperature anomaly that emanates from beneath it, and that has been documented by at least one credible witness in the historical record. Sixth, each structure was abandoned between 1950 and 1970, without any obvious economic or demographic reason, and none of the surrounding communities have been willing to purchase the property or repurpose the building. Seventh, each structure carries in its records or on its interior surfaces some form of the bisected circle symbol that appears on the pews of the Bittersweet Hollow Chapel. Eighth, and most significant, each structure is located within 1 mile of a geological feature that geologists classify as a karst window a subsidence feature, or an unexplained circular depression. These are places where the bedrock is known to have collapsed or shifted for reasons that mainstream geology cannot fully explain. The 63 structures identified by Corliss Ashworth are located across 19 states: Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and most surprisingly, one in Rhode Island. Every state in the eastern half of the country has at least one. Some have as many as 6. Ashworth mapped them. When he plotted the 63 locations on a topographical map of the eastern United States, a pattern emerged. The structures were not scattered randomly. They followed a network. Specifically, they followed the ridge lines of the Appalachian mountain chain, but they also branched off along secondary geological features that geologists have identified as ancient fault zones, dating back to the breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea some 200 million years ago. In other words, the structures sat directly on top of the oldest cracks in the crust of the eastern half of the continent. Ashworth did not stop at 63. He believed, based on his research, that the true number of such structures was considerably higher. He estimated that between 200 and 400 similar buildings had been constructed in the eastern United States between 1830 and 1860, and that many of them had already been lost to time, fire, demolition, or simple abandonment beyond recognition. He believed that a coordinated effort had been made, by parties unknown, to establish a network of watchers across the entire eastern seaboard within a very specific 30-year window. He believed that window was closing, and he believed the reason for it was simple. He believed the sealed passages were beginning to open. The theory that Ashworth developed, and that has been picked up by a number of Fear Tartaria researchers since his death, is as follows. At some point in the deep past, considerably older than the timeline of mainstream history, a civilization existed on the North American continent that possessed a technology capable of cutting perfectly circular shafts through solid bedrock and lining them with a glassy fused surface. This civilization used those shafts for a purpose we do not fully understand, possibly geothermal energy extraction, possibly transportation, possibly communication, possibly all three, possibly none of them. But when this civilization collapsed in whatever event caused its disappearance from the historical record, the shafts remained. And the things that had lived in the shafts, or had used the shafts, or had been kept in the shafts, remained as well. The event that ended this civilization is what Fear Tartaria researchers refer to as the Mud Flood. It occurred, based on architectural and geological evidence, in the very late 17th or very early 18th century. It buried the ground floors of buildings across the entire continent. It reset the calendar. It erased a chapter of human history that we have been told never existed. And it left behind, among many other things, a network of open shafts through the bedrock of the eastern United States, from which things periodically emerged. The mudflood generation, the survivors who came after the event, did what they could. They sealed the shafts they could find. They built structures on top of them to hold them shut. They passed the knowledge down from generation to generation, using cover stories about religion and community and quiet worship, because the truth would have been too much for anyone outside the immediate line of watchers to bear. And they lasted, in most cases, about 100 years, long enough for the memory to fade, long enough for the great-grandchildren to forget why the buildings had been built at all. That is the theory. It is unprovable. It is dismissed by mainstream historians. It is the kind of theory that gets people laughed out of academic conferences. But when you stand in front of a chapel in Bittersweet Hollow and you look down at the altar that sits crooked on top of a shaft that no one can explain, and you read a letter from 9 men who dedicated their lives to keeping something quiet, it becomes very difficult to laugh. There is another witness in this story who has not been mentioned yet and whose testimony is important because it comes from someone who lived within 3 ridges of the chapel for his entire life. His name is Owen Tobias Corbin. He is the grandson of the Corbin family whose hunting cabin was the nearest occupied structure to Bittersweet Hollow. He is now 74 years old. He still lives in Perry County, in a house his grandfather built in 1922, in a hollow that shares a ridge with Bittersweet. Owen Corbin gave a single interview in the winter of 2020, several months after the chapel was disassembled. The interview was conducted by a local journalist named Grace Meridian Fallon for a small regional publication called the Appalachian Reader. The article ran once in the January issue of that year and was pulled from the online archive within 6 weeks. Grace Fallon left journalism shortly afterward and now works as a school librarian in Lexington. She has declined to comment on why the article was removed, but we have the text of the interview because a subscriber to the print edition saved his copy and shared it with a small circle of Fear Tartaria researchers, and it is from that copy that I am reading now. Owen Corbin told Grace Fallon that his grandfather, whose name was Rutherford Kane Corbin, had known the last of the Watchers of the Deep personally. His grandfather had been friends with a man named Silas Winston Bawdrey, one of the 9 signatories on the letter from 1847. Silas Bawdrey was, of course, long dead by the time Rutherford Corbin was born in 1894. But Rutherford had known Silas's grandson, Ezekiel Malachi Bawdrey, who was the last living watcher in the hollow and who died in 1967, at the age of 89. According to Owen, his grandfather had visited the chapel many times as a young man in the 1910s and 20s. He had helped the watchers with their gardens, with their firewood, with the small maintenance tasks that a shrinking community could not handle on its own. In exchange, Ezekiel Bawdrey had told Rutherford Corbin things, not the whole truth, not what was actually in the shaft, but enough of the truth to leave an impression that Rutherford carried for the rest of his life and passed to his own grandson. Owen quoted his grandfather to Grace Fallon in the following words, quote, "Ezekiel told me that the chapel was not a church. He told me that the watchers were not Christians in any sense that a Baptist or a Methodist would recognize. He told me that they used the language of Christianity because it was the only language that would not draw questions from the neighbors, and because the community around them expected a certain kind of building on a certain kind of ridge. But he told me that what they were doing had nothing to do with God, and that if I ever set foot in the chapel after sundown, I was to leave immediately and never come back." End quote. Owen said his grandfather had followed that instruction his entire life. He had visited the chapel dozens of times during daylight hours. He had never once stayed past dusk, and he had passed the same instruction to his son, and his son had passed it to Owen, and Owen had never set foot on the property at all. Not because he was afraid, exactly, but because the instruction had been given, and the reason for the instruction was clear enough in its outline even if the specifics were never spoken aloud. Owen told Grace one other thing in that interview. He said that on the night of the 22nd of July 2019, which was the 6th day of the preservation crew's work at the chapel, and the day that Callum Whitaker first descended into the shaft, Owen had been awakened at approximately 3 in the morning by a sound coming from the ridge above his house. He described the sound as a slow, low pulse, about 12 pulses per minute. He said it lasted for approximately 45 minutes and then stopped. He said that the birds on his property did not sing the following morning. He said that the deer he normally saw grazing in the field behind his house did not come out for 3 days. He said, and this is a direct quote from the interview, quote, "My grandfather told me that when the watchers were gone, the sound would come back. He told me that the whole reason the watchers sat in that chapel for 120 years was to keep that sound from coming back. And on that night in July, when I heard it coming up from the ridge, I knew that whatever the watchers had been doing, they were not doing it anymore, because somebody had let it out." End quote. Grace Fallon asked Owen what he thought would happen next. Owen paused for a long moment before answering. His answer was recorded verbatim in the article. He said, quote, "I think the same thing is going to happen to us that happened to the town my grandfather told me about. The one in Pennsylvania. The one that opened in the winter of 1846. I do not know when it will happen. I do not know how many of us will survive it. But I know that we were warned, and I know that we did not listen. And I know that there is nothing to be done about it now, except wait." End quote. Owen Corbin still lives in his grandfather's house. He does not have a telephone. He does not use the internet. He grows most of his own food and traps most of his own meat. He is, by the standards of the modern world, a hermit. But he is one of the last living people who has heard with his own ears the sound that comes up from beneath the chapel in Bittersweet Hollow. And he is one of the last living people who understands what that sound means. There is one more piece of evidence that Ashworth included in his monograph, and it may be the most important piece of all. It concerns the Voynich manuscript itself and the reason that Bethany Whitaker recognized the script on the walls of the shaft. The Voynich manuscript is, as we said, an illustrated codex held at Yale University. Its authorship is unknown. Its language is unknown. Its purpose is unknown. Modern carbon dating has placed the vellum on which it was written to the early 15th century, roughly the years 1404 to 1438. But that dating refers only to the calfskin. The ink and the illustrations may be considerably older or considerably younger than the vellum. Nobody knows. The manuscript is divided into 6 sections. The largest section is filled with drawings of plants that do not correspond to any known species. The second section contains astronomical diagrams. The third section shows small female figures bathing in complex networks of tubes and pipes. The fourth section is cosmological, showing what appear to be maps of an unfamiliar sky. The fifth section describes what may be pharmaceutical preparations, and the sixth and final section, which is the shortest, consists of pages of dense text with no illustrations at all. It is the sixth section that Ashworth was interested in, because when he compared photographs of the sixth section of the Voynich manuscript to the photographs Bethany Whitaker had made of the writing in the Bittersweet Hollow shaft, he found that approximately 14% of the characters in the sixth section of the Voynich were identical or nearly identical to characters found in the shaft. He did not find every character, but he found enough. Enough that he concluded, and I quote from his monograph, quote, "The writing system used to inscribe the containment text in the Bittersweet Hollow shaft is the same writing system used by the author of the Voynich manuscript. This is not a coincidence. This is not convergent evolution. This is the same writer or the same tradition of writers working in the same script across a span of at least 4 centuries and across the Atlantic Ocean." End quote. If that is true, then the implications are considerable. It would mean that a body of knowledge existed hidden from mainstream history that connected a manuscript produced in 15th century Europe to a shaft cut into the bedrock of eastern Kentucky. It would mean that whoever wrote the Voynich was in some way part of the same tradition as whoever inscribed the shaft. It would mean that the containment of the passages was not a purely American phenomenon, and that the network of watchers extended at some point in its history across the Old World as well. Ashworth believed the connection went even further. He believed that the plants illustrated in the botanical section of the Voynich manuscript, none of which have ever been identified as real species, might not be plants at all. He believed they might be diagrams of the openings themselves, cross-sectional views of shafts and their surrounding root systems, drawn by someone who had descended into them and returned. He noted that many of the Voynich plants have unusual features: roots that split into multiple branches at strange angles, stems that show internal chambers, flowers that look nothing like flowers but very much like the alcoves Callum described in his notebook. He noted in particular one plant in the Voynich manuscript on folio 33 verso that features a central stem descending into what could be interpreted as a chamber. The chamber contains a small round object at its base. Surrounding the chamber at regular intervals around its circumference are 72 small rectangular openings. 72. The Bittersweet Hollow chamber contains 72 alcoves. Ashworth did not live to expand on this observation. His monograph was self-published in October of 2022, and he died of a stroke in January of 2023, 10 weeks after publication. He was 79 years old. He had been in good health up to the moment of his death. His research materials, including the annotated copies of the Voynich manuscript scans and the photographs of the Bittersweet Hollow inscriptions, were donated to a small archive at a Christian college in Kentucky. That archive burned in an unexplained fire in June of 2023. Nothing was saved. The monograph itself, of which perhaps 150 copies were printed, is the only remaining record of Ashworth's research. Copies still circulate in a small underground network of Fear Tartaria researchers, and it is one of those copies that provided the source material for this video. There is one more piece of the record that deserves attention, because it has to do with the copper coin that appeared on the plumb line on the 4th day of the excavation. That coin, as we mentioned at the beginning of this video, is now in a locked drawer at the University of Louisville. It arrived there in September of 2019, sent by Callum in a small padded envelope, addressed to a professor of numismatics named Dr. Thaddeus Cornelius Whitfield. Dr. Whitfield was, at the time, 68 years old. He was a specialist in pre-Columbian metalwork and had spent his career cataloguing the small collection of anomalous coins that periodically surfaced in American archaeological digs. His interest in unexplained numismatic finds was well known within his field, and Callum had chosen him deliberately as someone who might not immediately dismiss the coin as a hoax. Dr. Whitfield opened the envelope on the morning of the 11th of September 2019. He examined the coin under a microscope for approximately 45 minutes. Then he placed it in a locked drawer in his office. Then he wrote a 2-page letter to Callum in longhand on a yellow legal pad describing what he had found. The letter is preserved in Callum's papers. It reads, in part, as follows, quote, "The coin you have sent me is not identifiable within any known numismatic tradition. It is not Old World, it is not New World, it is not, so far as I can determine, of any period of human history that we have records for. The metal appears to be a copper alloy, but the alloy proportions are unusual. The copper is mixed with approximately 7% of an element that my equipment cannot fully identify, but which appears to share certain properties with tellurium and certain other properties with an element that has no place on the periodic table as it is currently understood. This is not a claim I make lightly. The markings on the coin are as unusual as the metal. On one face there is an image that could be interpreted as a human figure, but the proportions are wrong. The head is too small, the arms are too long, there are 5 fingers on each hand, but the fingers are not the same length as human fingers. On the other face there is a series of characters that I cannot read, but that bear a striking resemblance to a script I have seen only once before, in photographs of the Voynich manuscript held at Yale. I am not able to date the coin. Standard techniques do not apply. It shows no wear pattern consistent with circulation. It shows no oxidation pattern consistent with burial. It appears to have been made at some point in the past and preserved in a condition that should not be possible for any object exposed to normal atmospheric conditions for any length of time. If you press me for an age, I can only tell you that it is either extraordinarily old or extraordinarily recent, and that the extraordinary recent case would require a level of craftsmanship that I do not believe any modern forger possesses." End quote. Dr. Whitfield did not publish his findings. He kept the coin in the locked drawer in his office. He refused to discuss it with colleagues. He retired from the university in the spring of 2022 and moved to a small farm in southern Indiana where he still lives. He does not respond to correspondence about the coin. He has told the university that the drawer is to remain locked until his death, at which point the coin is to be donated to the Smithsonian Institution with instructions that it be catalogued as a curiosity of unknown provenance and stored permanently in a location that is not open to public view. In the summer of 2024, a hiker on the Cumberland Plateau reported hearing a low sound coming from a wooded hollow in Perry County, Kentucky. He described it as a slow rhythmic pulse, about 12 pulses per minute, that he could feel more than hear. He was several hundred yards from the source. He did not investigate. He hiked out of the area and reported it to the local sheriff's office, who noted the report in their log and took no further action. In the fall of 2024, 3 deer hunters in a neighbouring county reported an unusual event. They had set up a trail camera on a game trail. When they retrieved the memory card, they found that the camera had been triggered 11 times over a 3-week period, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always by something that moved past the camera too fast to be identified. The photographs showed only a blur. But in one photograph, the third from the last one on the card, there was a shape at the edge of the frame that could be interpreted as the profile of a human face turned in profile. The eyes appeared to be glowing faintly, in a dim greenish light. In the winter of 2025, a young Baptist minister in Western Virginia, doing research for a sermon on regional folk religion, came across the name of the Watchers of the Deep in an old church history. He became curious. He drove to the location of one of the 63 chapels identified by Ashworth, in a small hollow in Wise County. The chapel was still standing. It was condemned but not yet demolished. He entered the building. He walked to the altar. He tried to move it and could not because it was far too heavy. But he did notice when he knelt down beside it that the floor beneath the altar was cracked, that the crack ran in a perfect circle around the base of the stone, and that from the crack a very faint, very cold breath of air was rising. The minister did not go back. He wrote a letter to the diocese asking that the chapel be, in his exact words, quote, sealed with concrete as soon as possible before someone gets in there who does not understand what they are looking at, end quote. The diocese did nothing. The chapel still stands. The crack around the altar is, according to a hiker who visited the site in the spring of 2026, wider than it was the year before. This is where we are now. The chapel in Bittersweet Hollow no longer exists. It was disassembled by Callum Rees-Whittaker and his crew in the summer of 2019. The site is now overgrown. The foundation stones are still there. The altar is still there, sitting crooked over the shaft it was meant to seal. The trapdoor is still bolted shut. The leather-bound book is still inside it, or was, when Callum's widow last checked on the property in the fall of 2023. She has not been back since. The other 62 chapels identified by Ashworth are in various states of preservation. Some have been demolished, some are still standing. Some have been converted to other uses, including at least 3 that are currently being used as private residences by families who are almost certainly unaware of what is beneath their floors. None of them, as far as anyone knows, have been properly resealed. If Ashworth's theory is correct, if the mud flood happened, if the shafts are real, if the watchers were real, if the seals are failing, then we are approaching an event that human history has no framework to understand. The people who built the seals are gone. The knowledge of how to renew them is gone. The willingness to sit in a hollow for 4 generations watching a hole in the ground has, understandably, gone with them. And whatever is on the other side of those seals is, if we believe the letters and the notebooks and the trail camera photographs and the accounts of the surviving witnesses, waking up. There is no clean ending to this story. Callum is dead. Bethany is missing. Merrick is dead. Deirdre will not talk. Ashworth is dead. The 2 men in the unmarked vehicles were never identified. The federal agencies that Callum contacted denied all knowledge. The archive that held Ashworth's papers burned. The chapel in Bittersweet Hollow was disassembled and the altar was left in place, holding as best it can, over a shaft that leads to a chamber that contains 72 alcoves and 1 empty chair. The last thing I will tell you is this. In the personal journal that Callum kept in the final months of his life, which his widow allowed one researcher to read for a single afternoon in the fall of 2023, there is an entry from January of that year. It is dated the 14th. Callum had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 3 weeks earlier. He knew he did not have long. He was writing about Bittersweet Hollow. He wrote, and I will read this to you exactly as the researcher transcribed it, quote, if I had listened to Deirdre, if I had listened to my daughter, if I had left the trapdoor closed, Bethany would still be here. Merrick would still be here. I would still be dying, but of the cancer, not of the guilt. The passage was quiet before I opened it. It was quiet for 172 years, and now it is not, and I do not know how to close it again. And I do not think anyone else knows either. And that is what will kill me before the cancer does, end quote. He died 4 months after writing that entry. If you live in one of the 19 states on Ashworth's map, and if you have ever felt, on a quiet night, a low sound coming from somewhere beneath your house that you could not explain, then you already know why this video was made. You already know what is happening. You already know what to listen for. Do not investigate. Do not lift the stones. Do not open the trapdoors. Do not descend the shafts. Whatever the watchers of the deep were guarding, they were guarding it for a reason. They chose over and over across 4 generations to sit on top of it in silence. They chose to be forgotten. They chose to let their community die out rather than pass the knowledge to anyone who did not already understand the cost. They were not paranoid. They were not superstitious. They were not building a cover story for a family secret or a prohibition still or anything else that would fit into a normal explanation. They were doing exactly what they said they were doing. And now that they are gone, there is no one left to do it. If this video reached you, if you watched to the end, if you have felt something shift in the last few months that you cannot name and cannot explain, then subscribe to this channel. Because there are other stories, there are other hollows, there are other altars, there are other shafts, and we are going to walk you through every single one of them, in order until you have the complete map of what our ancestors were hiding from us and why they were hiding it. Next week we are going to a farmhouse in northern Vermont, where in 1971 a family disappeared from their kitchen in the middle of dinner, and the sheriff who investigated the case found, beneath the linoleum on the kitchen floor, a small circular opening cut into the bedrock, 47 inches in diameter, with writing on its walls. Until then, be careful what you dig up, be careful what you disturb, and if you hear breathing from beneath your floor, do not go looking for the source. Turn out the lights and go to bed.